Welcome to the riskadvisor.com podcast. I'm Sal Lafreri, and I'm here with my good friend and co-host, Jim Henry. So today we're going to go into part 2 of the Common Sense series that both of us thought would be a great idea and realized we're probably going to get ourselves in a world of trouble with. Trying to make sense out of what is making sense these days. Where are we? As part 2 of this, we decided to talk about the role of the integrator. And to do that, we figured there's no one better to interview than the co-host of the show, Jim Henry. Jim, you get to be on the hot seat today.
Looking forward to it.
So let's just give a brief overview of what an integrator is for those that are not familiar with it. So you have security consultants who identify, a particular need. You have security engineers that engineer systems, and then you have the integrator who basically gets stuck with the entire thing. He gets everything dumped on him and says, okay, now you got to put all of this together. You got to make all of these cute little toys work together and ultimately get them into a facility. And then with the ongoing support, you wind up being the guy that's responsible for all of that. So is that a fair assessment to what an integrator is?
Well, you really can't paint it with one broad brush. In some cases, the integrator is building to a very tight spec that may have been, put out with even a design from a design consultant. In some cases, the integrator is responsible to come up with a solution to a functional spec. In some cases, the integrator actually has some design latitude themselves. So, the old adage is you've seen one spec, that means you've seen one spec because, they can be very, very, very different from each other. Some integrators are good at playing one role and not the other. Some are large enough and adaptable enough that they can work very tightly with a design consultant or have a free hand in using their judgment. But the one common denominator I can say, that joins all systems integrators together is that, as a rule, they all feel like goalies on a dart team with no pads. Because it is the integrator that stands between either the contracting department, which is maybe the general contractor or the end user, and completion. And anything that goes wrong, he is the first guy and easiest one to reach at the table.
Well, you're the first guys that touch it, right?
Because we are the last guys that touch it. That's for sure.
But clearly, the last.
In the immortal words of a good friend of mine, Phil Aronson, he said, the integrator is the trade that is the last one in, and we never leave. Because, these systems all require maintenance and what have you. And as much as the construction industry, tries to classify us as a trade, just like plumbing and electrical and whatnot, electronic security, very, very software centric now. It's not hardware. It's not just about hanging devices. It's about how these devices, communicate with each other. And very often, and I've been on multiple seminars on this and in conferences and what have you, about the difficulty the integrator has being the recipient of sometimes a partial design by a consultant who is then excused by the general contractor because they don't want to pay the consultant to be on the project for the entire time. They turn it over to the integrator. The integrator's told, you got to get $100,000 out of this $500,000 job, right? The integrator is left to his own devices on how best to do that. Well, do you skinny up on the backbone? Do you eliminate devices? Do you do a little of both? And without the end user and the consultant being party to that conversation, whatever decision the integrator makes will be torpedoed as being the wrong one or self-serving. So it's a real challenge. And then, of course, the consultant comes back and the consultant, to do the acceptance test. And he looks around and he goes, what happened to my job? And he looks at the integrator like, what the hell did you do? So, you are clearly, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. The experienced integrators learn from those harrowing experiences and are wise enough to defend themselves or to qualify those decisions as not as being maybe the least of bad of all the bad options, but try to make sure that they're presenting the pros and cons of of certain decisions, so at least it's memorialized in those meetings or descoping meetings that they're having, so that if there is some question later on that conveniently other stakeholders have forgotten or eliminated, that you have the minutes of those meetings that you proactively share to memorialize those decisions, so that you aren't second guessed going forward.
Well, how many times does that happen when you just sit in a meeting and they just, even in the beginning, when you sit there and you go in as a consultant and you make all these recommendations and they just start wiping stuff off even before they get it to the actual spec, and then you come back later on and then you realize, oh, gee, why wasn't this there? It's like, well, you cut it. Well, no, I didn't. Yeah, you did.
Very short memories. No, the integrator, I learned, even though I went to school for electrical engineering and, I figured I was in a trade, I learned very early on and was taught well by my dad and my uncles, you almost have to act like an attorney and a stenographer in those meetings, memorializing who said what to whom, and what was recommended and what have you. And, you should, even if it's a recommendation that is, that may take money out of your pocket, you need to, because at the end of the day, being a trusted advisor is the biggest asset that you have. You are not just a means to buy stuff. You are bringing in the wisdom of how to deploy the solutions. Manufacturers make a lot of good equipment. Some of them are good fits for projects. Some of them are not. But it's the responsibility of the integrator, who wants to be around for many, many decades, to understand the nature of the business of their customers, understand how they're going to be using these systems. Is it a wise deployment? Do they have the staffing to be able to utilize these solutions? Or is it just a boatload of bells and whistles that are never going to get used? And all they really want to do is open and close the doors and be able to pull video, if they have an incident, which is, not wrong in and of itself, that you really need to understand what the application is. And, and sometimes manufacturers, there's good and bad in everybody. There's good and bad in integrators, good and bad in manufacturers, good and bad in consultants. And the bottom line is that, you really need to look at holistically at it from the end user's point of view. It is very helpful to have the end user understand by dialogue with the consultant and even at times from the GC that this is not a spectator sport. The end user at the end of the day is the one that is going to make use of this system and get beneficial use from it. And they should not, basically, turn those decisions off to others, on their behalf, because at the end of the day, they're the only ones that are really there, looking out for their own best interests.
How many times have we seen it where the consultant comes in and says something, makes the recommendation, and then all of a sudden the job gets turned over to the GC, and the client, more times than not, will have either a developmental section or, a construction division or something where it falls out of. So you're consulting to the C-level person who says that, yes, they want to have this, and you come up with this agreement, and all of a sudden they hand it off to development, and development winds up bringing in the GC, and before you know it, you've lost contact with what they wanted to do. And you go back to, development, and you say, look, we need to have explosive detection capability, or we need to have, whatever we're looking for. And they turn around and say, yeah, I'm not sure we're going to get that. It's not in the budget. You go, yeah, but the guy who you report to said that he wanted that. Yeah, well, we're just not going to be doing that. We just don't have the budget.
And then you have the third leg of the stool, which is the operations folks, that generally is the true customer, in the long run for the integrator, and they are often not even invited to the table.
That's the major problem. Yeah. They just don't get invited. So they develop a system, the security systems develop, that has absolutely no real application to the building. And if you in some of the systems, right, you try and execute the system the way it's designed, it brings the building to a total standstill, and then operations goes nuts on you. Right? They go, Look, what? Look, why did you do this? I didn't.
Well, if I had a magic lamp, and I rubbed it, and the genie came out, and I got one wish, my wife would probably say, "And you gave that wish away for what?" But it really would be that end users understand they need to have their operational people present in the consideration for and in the modification of these systems, because at the end of the day, it is that operational group that will be running this system. And there's no better way to avoid problems and ensure a return on the investment that they're making than to have at least a seat at the table. So at least then even the operations people can't complain. Well, I can't make use of this. I wasn't part of it. Well, if they're part of the team, then they have ownership of it, and they have an even greater vested interest in seeing that they will make it work.
It's like in the planning process for everything, and this is no different. When you look at when you put a plan together, a crisis plan or whatever, and you say, okay, so who would we need to get around the table? And obviously, it's always the bosses want to get around the table to make the decision, and you say, okay, so in the event that we, the critical people that we need to get access into a building, and a hurricane or whatever, adverse weather condition, what are we going to do? And the senior leadership's got to be in. And you go, okay. And the question I always love to ask is, so who's going out of the group of you? Who's going to replenish the toilet paper in the bathroom? And they just start looking at each other, and it's like, maybe we should get somebody from facilities in here. How much of this are we really going to need? Walk us through the process of how an integrator gets involved in the projects.
Well, in some cases, and this was often the case before 9/11, the integrator has a relationship, with an end user in many cases, servicing, systems that they may have even deployed as a design build, and they continue that, and they're looked at as a trusted advisor, and as new technologies, evolve, they, present them, they qualify them, and they present them after they've gone through their vetting process, to the end user, and the pros and cons of those solutions, and why they think that they're future-proofing the solutions, for the end users are valid. So the downside of that is generally you're not working with a big construction budget. The upside is you are working directly with the end user, and it's easy to have those conversations and vettings, in that environment. After 9/11, when security was recognized as a need that was budgeted in the MEP, then you had, design consultants becoming much more active, risk analysis, system designs and whatnot, and projects, moved from tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars into the millions and sometimes the tens of millions of dollars. Those typically that one go out to to an RFP or an RFI, and then boil that down to RFPs, from multiple integrators to a design spec that would either be a 30% design, a 50% design, a 90% design. And you go through that vetting process of qualifications of experience. Are you certified in the platforms that are called for? What's your experience in projects of that size, past references, and what have you. And that has been pretty much commonplace now for the last, 2 decades now since 9/11. We're moving into a little bit of a different environment now where, we're seeing compliance starting to come out first on the FedGov side with cyber driving a different set of requirements and expertise that are required of the integrator than what seemed hard at the time, but was really in retrospect a lot easier. Just understanding, the electronic systems that you were deploying and how to make use of them. Now you have to be far more conscious, of the ramifications and the exposure, of those solutions. And if you're using networks other than what you are deploying for the solution, that's an awareness that you need to make sure the end user understands, and risks that the end user understands that you can only to a degree control. But if there are hard specifications there, for products that are not hardened and are vulnerable, and if they are not maintained and what have you, there is risk to your electronic security systems from a cyber perspective. And as an old school electronic security guy, I'd be the first to tell any end user, the threat to your systems are much greater from a cyber threat than, in the old cases, we used to just say a door forced open. Somebody takes a door to get into a cart, you put a chock in the door, and now people come and go. Well, the damage that you can do through a cyber breach is far more extensive than that.
All right. When the next two sections we want to get into is about research and evaluation. And that's one particular topic that I'm really interested in hearing what you got to say. But before we get into that, I want you to know that you are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by Jim Henry and me, Sal Lafreri. We're going to ask you to download and subscribe to the show and rate us on iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. Also, follow us on our social media pages like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. All right, Section 2, Integrators research and evaluation processes. How do you go about, or how does an integrator go about product evaluation and research?
Well, it's got two elements to it, or actually three elements to it. Of course, you are looking at the installed history of a product, if it has any. If it's really a new technology, a new deployment, then that's going to be very limited. But there will always be some. So in addition to bringing the product in and doing the best that you can to lab test it, in environments that replicate, the real life applications out there in the field, whether it's, camera systems and under certain lighting conditions or certain types of movement or, maybe some thermal conditions or amount of activity or what have you. But the other very trustworthy means is through our peers. And although integrators compete with each other, they share information with each other, because the one common thing that we all have together is that we all know that we're told baloney by some manufacturers. So, manufacturers are out there to promote their product and sell their product.
Doesn't always work as designed.
It doesn't always work as designed. And, in many cases, the manufacturers, and I'm not, again, there's good and bad in everybody, but, you need to insulate yourself against the worst case conditions. And oftentimes, in the old days when we used to be able to go to trade shows, not all these virtual trade shows now, but, you'd be able to go right up to the equipment there, and test drive it.
Kick the tires.
And hit the Control-Alt-Delete. See if the system crashes. It's amazing what happens when you do things like that. But, everything looks great on a trade show floor, which is why it's dangerous to have end users, go to trade shows and be subject to the propaganda that they get at the booth, coming away thinking, I can throw all my other stuff away. This is going to do everything. It's
a shiny new toy.
It's a shiny new toy. But the reality is the trade show is one thing, and real life deployment over a period of time is yet another. So integrators, integrators that have been around a while have, an inner circle of trust of those that they know. They may be competition, but, they're quality competition. They go through the same vetting process. I may have the opportunity in one area of the country because of the vertical market that I'm in to see a technology, before, some other areas. So I would align myself. We did a lot, my early days, we did a lot of mass transit, and public agency work. Well, generally technology first comes out, for military deployment. Then it moves into public agencies, then it moves into, other vertical market applications. So, I would often go to trade shows, for markets other than what I was in. I used to love to go to NAB, National Association of Broadcasters, because that's where you would see the technology in cameras that was coming out 5 years before it would come into physical security. The development of imagers and what have you for broadcast, and for high-end broadcast and for DoD applications, that's where it would go. That's where it would be vetted first, and then you'd see it trickle down into physical security. And I have one anecdotal story. In the early days of chip imagers, after we moved from tubes to chips, there were two technologies. One, without getting too technical, one's frame transfer, and the other one is interline transfer. And they're very good. The frame transfer is very good at capturing images. And if you aggregate the frames, you can make it look like you have much lower light sensitivity. than you normally would if you were not aggregating those frames. So clever salespeople for a manufacturer in this case, took a camera and did a demo with it and said, look at that picture. It looks like daytime, right? It's, and look at, there's no light there. It's like 0.001 foot candles and what have you. So, we're taking a look at this and we're looking at the sensitivity. We understand what's going on. We say to ourselves, okay, is that the camera right there? Is that the image you're looking at? Yes. Wave our hand in front of it, looked at the picture, no sign of the hand. I said, okay, so this is great. So you're aggregating the frames, and that enables you to make it look like you have a lot more sensitivity because you're collecting light over time. Like if you're an old film photographer, you understand, you extend
leave the shutter open.
Leave the shutter open, and it's going to, yeah. But I said, you know what? We're not. This isn't the photography business. This is security. We're looking for bad people that are moving. I'd rather see a snowy picture of somebody that's moving than a beautiful picture of my fence line with no movement at all, even though people were jumping back and forth across it like bunny rabbits. So I said, and I thought it was a great example because we were out there with some young engineers that we had just hired, and we said, this is what you run into. Right? You always have to be questioning, how are they doing this? And does it have downsides to it that they're just not exposing? And because God forbid, we just listen to what we're told, go and present this to an end user, say, this is great. They spend thousands of dollars on these fancy new cameras and they get robbed blind and nothing is recorded because they didn't see any of the movement. So, the integrator has to defend themselves by being very inquisitive. Inquiring minds want to know, right? And making sure that they play devil's advocate before they either agree to deploy to a design that's been put together and they don't question those things, or they present, those downsides, to the end user, well, you're enamored with this sensitivity and these images, but, there's a price to pay for it. So depending on the application, you really have to weigh those differences, and in some cases, more is not more.
Where do you go for training and current knowledge, like what's breaking?
Everywhere. You need to get it from multiple sources. You get the manufacturer direct training. I love the trade show environment, and I hope that opens up back again in the springtime where we can do live collaboration and networking. Because not only do you network with your peers, end users out there, consultants, just that exchange of experiences and ideas and vetting, especially with technology moving as fast as it does today, you're really learning every minute of every day. Read the articles, vet them. If you see something that looks interesting, call some people, see what they've heard about it, what have you. And you really got to do your due diligence, but there's no one source. There is clearly more and more a working collaboration with design consultants and with risk consultants. Is becoming more commonplace. That type of collaboration or relationship really didn't exist 20 years ago. It was more that the integrators of the day were looked at as competition by the consultants and vice versa.
But the consultants weren't installing the equipment.
The consultants weren't installing the equipment, but
why would they?
Because the integrators in some cases were designing solutions because they had experience, right? Okay. And the budget wasn't there, for a separate consultant, and in some cases, integrators were given specs by consultants that didn't have the field experience, and ended up deploying something, that didn't work and got blamed for it. So then they looked with suspicion, at the consulting community, and like it's what anything else, there's good and bad, but having the opportunity to have a collaborative dialogue as part of a team with the end user, the consultant, and the manufacturer and the integrator, and that really is the foundation of why Ray Coulomb started Security Specifiers, well over a decade ago now, and I think that's been an increasingly warm relationship. between consultants and integrators that see the value that each bring to the table.
Well, it takes away the whole design build, competition in there, right? So an integrator comes in and wants to do a design build. We don't need the consultant.
But an integrator can provide their constructive perspective to an open-minded consultant that doesn't have the benefit of that field experience, and that really is the best of all possible worlds.
All right. In the next section, we're going to get into solutions. But first, just to remind everyone that you're listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by Jim Henry and me, Sal LaFurry. We're going to ask you once again to please download and subscribe to the show and give us a rating on your favorite podcast platform. Also, please remember to follow us on social media pages like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Okay, let's get into section 3, and that's going to be solutions. So one of the things that people say about you personally is that you just seem to have this great ability to see what's coming in the future. So where do you see technology going in the next 5 years?
There's nothing magical about that, and I don't have any gift other than knowing enough to know what I don't know.
Too much experience, too many years experience. Right? Is this it?
Knowing enough to know what I don't know, having a sense of where the vulnerabilities are, and knowing that when you have the proliferation of cyber attacks and major system failures and big unwanted press, from the consequences of those failures, that issue of insulating yourself from those cyber threats and from the threats that the internet bring are huge. And there's always necessity is the mother of invention, and those risks can and will be solved. It has to start, though, with recognizing that there's a risk there. You can't just, because it's convenient and you've got a network drop there, just throw devices on it because, a minute after you plug them in, I've got video. Everything's well and good. No. That you haven't begun to see what the consequences of that are. So, I think, initially it really requires a level of awareness, expertise, and education on a part of the integrator. To be, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. I often say that.
Jim Henry's favorite line: "Just because you can doesn't mean you should."
Doesn't mean you should. But there will be, and there will continue to be, an exponentially increasing number of technologies out there that are leveraging the ever smaller and ever more powerful, microprocessors. Machine learning will eventually become, the analytics and whatnot of artificial intelligence. It's not really artificial intelligence. It's just really smart machine learning that looks like artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence that doesn't take long to become more intelligent than a number of human elements that are trying to make determination. But that's a tool to be used constructively. It shouldn't ever replace common sense. You should still be looking at something saying, does that appear logical to me? But analytics that can provide that kind of data to collaborate and corroborate, with your common sense can make you much more, responsive to a solution rather than, sitting there trying to discern, anomalies, within a picture or to correlate what's going on between multiple scenes at the same time. So, I really do think that the movement of this intelligence and the analytics, the processing, in some cases even the storage, out to the edge is going to continue. I always believe, as most integrators believe, that there's no one technology or one approach that is a one-size-fits-all. So the more that you can triangulate different types of detection technologies, that gives you redundancy, and it decreases your nuisance alarm rate, your false alarm rate, which then brings confidence that when something is brought to your attention, more often than not, there really is something there that is a problem. Because if you're continuously going into alarm, for things that are not real, human nature is that the security personnel, will tend to ignore it. Just hit, okay, acknowledge, without taking it seriously. So it's really important to have event-driven technologies, be trustworthy and proven for the environment that they're in. That, again, when you have the confidence of the people that are using it, they really pay attention to it and they treat it as actionable intelligence and they act accordingly. That is going to get smarter and smarter and smarter. The integrator needs to realize that their role in setting those solutions up is going to become less proactive than it has been in the past, because the systems are becoming more intelligent, where they find themselves on the network, they can program themselves on the network, and even program themselves to the environment and to the application that they're being deployed. These were tasks normally done early on, by the integrator. But the integrator is used to reinventing themselves every couple of years. I mean, in the early days, he spent out. We would, the integrator's role was changing tubes and cameras and limit switches and pan and tilts. Nobody does that anymore because there's just no need. So you have to be open to that change.
Is today's technology make it more difficult or less difficult to be an integrator?
Both. It's both. Okay. If you aren't educated on today's technology and where it's going, it can be overwhelming. If you are, you can leverage it from a sales and marketing perspective, because you can speak intelligently to that, to the consultants and to the end users, to give them a comfort level, that you're not just receiving something, opening it up and reading the instructions and then deploying according to the way that's instructing you. And it's really key. And I think, there is a movement within consultants to understand that level of experience, expertise, and training and certification on behalf of the integrators is actually something to be vetted when you are selecting, an integrator. And that really should be considered a value point, as much or more so even than past experience with other technologies.
You mentioned earlier about edge devices. We had a show about it recently, talking about technology going to the edge. Where do you see the integrated role going if edge devices actually do become the norm? And all indication is that that's what is going to occur. How does that affect the integrator's role?
Well, it's in one area, it's scary because a lot of the hardware infrastructure that the integrator has sold and maintained in the past, servers, panels, what have you, sometimes storage arrays, that's going to go away. But you can't deny that as the systems can be proven to be hardened against threats, which is really what drove maintaining a lot of on-premise systems earlier on, because there was fear, of pumping everything up to the cloud over the internet. And, can we really trust that? But as that is being addressed now by newer technologies and by wireless solutions, in some cases, private, cellular networks and whatnot that keep you completely off of the internet, your role is going to change. You're going to be your services are going to turn more, into being a solutions advocate, being able to support the application and the utilization and the management, of those solutions. You will become less hardware intensive, but IT went through this and is going through it again. I mean, IT 20 years ago, differentiated themselves from the security systems integrator, which largely relied on the margin of sale of hardware, for their profit to support, the training and education, of their staff. And IT basically said, what, it's all about the knowledge and the programming and the setup and the support, and there's very little margin on the equipment. Well, security is following that same evolution model that IT has already gone through, and IT now is going through it again because, they also are going through an experience where these on-site server farms and what have you and storage farms, they're moving virtual. So, in both cases, it's going to be the managed services and the wisdom of what to deploy and how to configure it and how to support the end user's education process of utilizing those systems is going to be their role.
Last question before we close. If the systems are becoming as technically savvy and smart or intelligent as we understand they can be. Does the technician, the service technician, do they actually have a future role? Because it's plug and play devices, and the device is telling you when it's sick and it's got to come off. What happens to the technician?
Their role changes, but I don't ever see that level of technical expertise, being completely supplanted. It will morph into a different form. But overall, what is at risk is, our staff that are more menial tasks, just running around and, validating that a device is there and doing a little checkbox of where devices are and what have you. But it will elevate. I think that the integrator's role is just, it's in a broad sense, it's just moving from blue collar to white collar. And it's going to be much more of a profession going forward than a trade. So, there is a challenge there and an opportunity, for those that may have been in a different capacity or working for systems integrators, but are looked at as trusted advisors, to their end users, because when they have a problem, they always respond. And if they are open to, the continued education and adapting, and augmenting their knowledge base, to the newer solutions, there'll always be a need, always be a position for them.
All right. Well, you've been listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by Jim Henry and myself, Sal LaFreri. We're going to ask you to subscribe to this show, and please like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to be able to set that up. Also, if you happen to know someone that would make a great guest, please go to the webpage, theriskadvisor.com, to make your suggestion. Remember, you can hear the show on your favorite podcast platform, YouTube, and of course, stream it at theriskadvisor.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you tune in next week.